everyone, and welcome to another Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Jeanette, and thank you for joining us here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. That is where I am tuning in live on July 24th, 2025, exactly at 3 p.m. Pacific time. So if you're joining with us, there's a really great thing that comes with joining us on Aquarium Online Academy. If you're joining us live, the wonderful part is that we're able to interact with you and you're able to interact with us up here. And I am not alone today. I'm going to be on screen, but I do have a few people, coworkers behind the scenes that are going to help me out displaying all of this wonderful media that we're going to take a look at together. So we do have Edgar and Connolly here doing a lot of the behind the scenes work and working the magic so we can see all of the wonderful media that we're going to be talking about together today. And if you are joining us live on July 24th, 2025, exactly at 3 p.m. Pacific time, you are able to interact with us by maybe texting in any questions or any observations you might have. So you're able to do that in the number below. So you can text us live questions at 562-286-1838. If you are happen to not be watching us live, maybe it's at a different time, a different day, you can always watch us still, but you're maybe having any questions or any observations at a later time, you can also email us those questions. We always have someone responding to those emails, and that is live at lbaop.org. All right, my friends. So, just like I mentioned today, we are tuning in from the Aquarium of the Pacific out in Long Beach, California. So maybe you've visited us today. If you haven't, do not worry because we're going to bring the exploration to your own home. So, what we're going to be doing today, you might have figured out by the title of this video, is we're going to talk about turtles. All right, so before we even get into the topic of turtles, I want us to take a step back and I want us to warm up our scientist brains. So, in order for us to do that, we're going to start talking about what exactly makes a reptile a reptile. And when we're talking about reptiles, turtles actually fall into a group of animals that we know as reptiles. And turtles are not the only ones that make up this group. There is a variety. Maybe we can get a sneak peek of what they are, like the one that just popped up on the screen behind me. So, what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to step off the screen in a bit, but here is your mission. You're going to think about what is a reptile. And we're going to use this beautiful example like the one behind me. Okay? So I want you to use your observation skills. So thinking about observations, any patterns, any colors, any body structures you might be noticing, or maybe you already know some other reptiles that exist, or maybe you have some reptiles as pets, right? Some reptiles can be kept as pets. And I want you to think about what you notice about them, because if they're all in this group that makes up these reptiles, they need to have something in common. So let's see what we can figure out. I'm going to go ahead and step off the screen just for a few seconds while I let you warm up those scientific brains of yours. So again, we're making a variety of different observations. It might be some colors that you might be seeing. It might be some body structures that you might be seeing. Or it also might be if you have maybe a reptile as a pet, maybe you're looking directly at them right now, and you might be noticing something about them. Or even if you've seen maybe a turtle picture in general, you can also start thinking about, what do turtles have in common with this friend that we have up on our screens? Or maybe your pet reptile at home. So, what could it be that they have in common? I'll give you a few more seconds before I step on to that screen and we can discuss maybe some observations together. Again, if you are watching us live, feel free to join in on the conversation if you want to text us in any observations. Again, that number is on the screen below if you are watching us live. All right, my friends. So I'm going to go ahead and step back on the screen with us. So let's think about what things we are noticing. So if we take a look at my reptile friend right behind me, there are some initial observations that we might be noticing together, right? So one of the things that makes a reptile is this scaly skin. They kind of look like little tiny tiles if you ever take a look at kind of like a mosaic or like the pattern on the bottom of the floors, right? We're seeing all of these little tiny circular patterns. You can point them out right here, right down here. They're a little bit more obvious, right? But those are what part of their scaly skin. So having those scales makes a reptile a reptile. So that's one way you can figure out if an animal is a reptile or not. But they're not only having scaly skin, right? Another thing that makes them up is that they are also in this group of animals that we call vertebrates. All right. And believe it or not, we're also kind of vertebrates because if you take a look, right, if you touch this hard bone right down your back, right, that is your vertebrate bone, right? So all reptiles are also vertebrates, okay? They also, if you think about it, they are also laying eggs. So maybe you have a pet at home, or maybe you've seen some eggs or seen some videos of some turtle eggs, right? Reptiles are also known to lay eggs. And that is how they are born. So they have much more of a hatching day. All right. Another thing that we can think about, maybe we can compare them to our own selves, right? Because we're not reptiles, we're actually mammals, right? One thing we can think about is that they are cold-blooded. Now, if you touch your forehead, go ahead and do that with me. If you touch your forehead, right, it actually feels nice and warm, or hopefully it does feel nice and warm, right? But if you touch your forehead, it should give you a nice temperate or nice warm feeling, right? That is because we are warm-blooded. So our bodies naturally are able to or use their energy, right, to keep ourselves either at that same temperature that we want. Okay, for example, if you're out, if it's a nice hot day, you've been out running with your friends all day, all morning, right, and the sun is just beating on your head, your body starts to sweat, right? So that is your body's way of kind of trying to cool yourself down. On the opposite end, if it's very, very, very cold, your body may start to shiver, right? So, being that your body is shivering, that is your body's way of trying to make your body return to that normal temperature, a little bit warmer, kind of like when we touched our foreheads, right? Our body automatically does that on its own because we are what we call warm-blooded animals. On the opposite, very different from us, reptiles are what we know as cold blooded animals. So their bodies naturally cannot control that temperature by either shivering or maybe sweating like we do. What their body actually does is that they actually have to physically move to a warmer place to absorb that heat, which is why you see a lot of reptiles kind of taking that what we call sunbathing. You might see some lizards maybe laid out on a nice warm rock directly under the sun. Or if you have any pets as reptiles, you might find that it's very important. Someone might recommend that you need a heat lamp in order to keep them warm, right? So those are some initial things that make reptiles reptiles. And since turtles actually fall in the reptile group, that means that turtles also have all of these wonderful things that we're just discussing, right? So if we think about turtles as a group, right, they are very, very large group of animals and they vary in different adaptations. So if we think about what the word adaptation means, it means that they have different things on their bodies or maybe inside of their bodies that we can't see that help them live and survive and thrive in their habitat or their home. And that is because their habitats might look very, very different. We have a variety of turtles. We have land turtles, right? We have freshwater turtles, and we also have sea turtles. So if we think about the ones that we're looking right behind me, we're going to be focusing mainly on our sea turtle group. And the reason that these three groups are so different from each other is because, like we talked about, they might have different adaptations on their bodies. One of them being maybe they have different shells, right? If you think about a land turtle, they have more of a domed, higher shell, right? That is because they have to have a stronger, sturdier structure, right? With more larger legs, kind of like elephant type legs, right? Because they need to be a lot more sturdy when they're walking on land. When we're talking about turtles that live under the sea, they might have something very different than elephant like sturdy legs, right? They have more of a flipper like limbs. And we also find that their shells are less sort of like high, more flatter, right? So they can actually glide through the ocean water. Another way that they are very different is their habitat. So if you're thinking about what the word habitat means, that is their home. That is where they're living. Since they're living in that general area, you also find that they have different food sources, right? So food that you find in and out of the water is going to be very, very different. Okay? So because that food source is very, very different, you might find that maybe some turtles might be herbivorous, meaning that they're mostly eating lots of greens. Some turtles might be carnivorous, meaning that they're getting more of most of their nutrition, all of their nutrition actually, by meat. And they might be omnivorous, right? Meaning that they're doing a little bit of both. And that highly depends on where exactly they're living. Where is their habitat? Because their food actually has to be living with them. All right, my friends. So now that we took a deep dive on a little bit of talking about turtles, we're going to focus on the group that we see behind me. These are our sea turtles, and there are 7 species of sea turtles in general, right? I believe the one I have behind me is an olive ridley. It looks like an olive really to me. And you'll be able to tell because it has more of an olive tone color, right? So we have a variety of different sea turtles. Again, 7 species to name a few. Maybe there's olive ridleys like the one we have here, right? We also have green sea turtles, right? We're also going to be talking a little bit about our famous one, our leatherback sea turtles, which we'll be looking at in a second, just like this one. And I know we have someone in the room whose favorites is leatherback sea turtles, right? So maybe we can share some beautiful pictures with us. All right. So thinking about the variety of different sea turtles, one thing that we also want to focus on, and we might come back to this at the end, is that unfortunately a lot of our sea turtle species are what we call endangered. And this might be a new word for you. Maybe you've heard it before, right? But that means that the populations of a lot of these sea turtles, these 7 species of sea turtles, right, are in danger of not existing any longer. All right. So that means that we have to do something to make sure that we maybe reverse this. And maybe we'll be able to share a lot of what we might be able to do once we learn a little bit more about them. Because if we want to protect them, and ultimately, if that is going to be our goal, then we want to make sure that we know how to do it. And one way that I enjoy doing that is maybe learning a little bit about them. Okay, so if we take a closer look, we're going to go ahead and start venturing in the world of leatherback sea turtles. So again, we have a fan favorite in the room with us today, right? Maybe by the end of our discussion today, maybe you'll be a fan favorite of our leatherback sea turtles like the ones we see here. All right. So, what exactly makes a leatherback sea turtle special? Right? One of the things we can talk about is I'm going to step off the screen in a bit, but you could start making initial observations, right? Some things you might be noticing of our leatherback sea turtle. And I actually have a really cute plushie, right here that you can also make observations on, right? So, if we have our general plushie here, or you can make observations of the one behind me, right? But what are some things you are noticing? So again, maybe you're noticing some body structure, some colors, maybe some patterns, right? Maybe you can think about how they are behaving. Like a behavior would be, how do you think they're swimming, right? Do you think they swim fast? Do you think they swim slow? What do you think they eat? Okay. So see if you can find any clues about any of those things. So again, I'm gonna step off the screen for a second, but I want you to initially think about what you're noticing. All right. So again, if you are watching us live, you're more than welcome to text us any of those observations about our leatherback sea turtles. Or if you're watching at us at a later time, you can also email us those questions at a later time. But let's take a closer look together. So, one of the things I initially think about when I see a leatherback sea turtle is I see kind of these little ridges. I'm going to point them out to you right here, right? These kind of lines that go all the way down their backs, right? Or their shells. So, all of those ridges, right? They have about 5-ish ridges or so, right? But it gives them that mobility to be what we call hydrodynamic. There we go, right? So it gives them the ability to smoothly glide on the ocean floor. Another thing you might notice that is on all of those beautiful patterns or that beautiful coloration of our leatherback sea turtles. So they're mostly a deep tone color, maybe closer to black, dark, very, very dark gray color, and they look very, very sleek. So they look kind of like if they're very smooth, right? We also have a variation of all of these little tiny spots here, right? When we think about all of these little tiny spots or any animal that has spots, we call this disruptive camouflage. So thinking about zebra, how zebra has stripes, or thinking about how a giant sea bass or maybe a seal has all of those little spots, right? It's able to camouflage with its environments depending on what it looks like. So for our leatherback sea turtles, they have a variety of those different little tiny spots. All right. And thinking about how they're swimming, right? One observation you might make is that they're probably not walking around like us with our 2 feet, right? But they're mostly using those flippers to move and swoosh their way around the ocean. So they're kind of making that row. If you think about how like a boat paddle is rowing across the bottom of the ocean floor, right? They're doing that same movement. They're pushing with their strong flippers, just like this beautiful video that we have here, right? They're pushing themselves through that water with these very strong flippers, right? To push themselves and guide themselves to be able to swim very, very well under the water. So again, very different than us with our 2 feet, right? And if we think about the texture of them, we also see that all of these turtles have these shells, right? The shell of the leatherback looks very different than the one that we just saw a video of that sea turtle swimming, right? That is because they have more of a thin, leathery consistency to their shell. So it's a little bit thinner and it's more smooth like we talked about. So if you ever thought about like maybe touching or feeling some leather, right? That is exactly how that smooth feeling is. And again, it helps them be hydrodynamic. So meaning it helps them be able to glide through that ocean water. All right, my friends. Another thing that makes these wonderful animals, right, very, very great is their size. So, our leatherback sea turtles can actually grow up to be about 6 feet. To give you a little bit of measurement, I am 5 feet. Okay, so a leatherback sea turtle will be a whole foot, a whole entire foot taller than I am or bigger than I am. Okay, with that comes a lot of weight. So for our leatherback sea turtles, they could be about 2,000 pounds. And that means that they're going to be eating a lot of food. Okay? And they're going to be eating that food very differently than us because they're not going to have our teeth, our shiny teeth that we have. They're going to have a very different structure in their mouth. And that's what I want to take a closer look at now. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my dog cam now. And I have a really awesome treat for us because we're going to take a closer look at what a turtle jaw looks like. And we're going to take a look inside its mouth. So I have a skull, a turtle skull here that we're going to take a closer look at. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom out of here. Let's see, I'm going to put this just as reference so I can see how much I'm going to be zooming out of here. There we go. All right, let me go ahead and lower our brightness just a little bit as well. I also have a blue paper. Maybe that'll help us out a little bit, right? But we have our skull right here. There we go. All right. We have our skull right here. What we're looking at right now is the side view. So think about if we were looking at me from my side, maybe my right or left side right here, right? This is the section for its eye. So I'm going to turn us over, kind of like if you're looking inside its mouth, right? So if we think about what we're looking at right now, we're looking at the roof of its mouth right here. And those two holes that go up there are actually the direction of their nose, where their nose would be. But I want to point out, I'm going to hold it at a different angle. Maybe we'll get a better view, right? If this is the top of its mouth or the front of its mouth, and that's where it's mostly doing the eating, you might notice that it has lots of little ridges here, right? It has a larger ridge and then it has little smaller ridges on those edges, right? And they kind of look like scissors, right? And that is because they're using this sort of like the trump in their mouth, right? To be able to act like those scissors. So there we don't see any visible teeth in the jaw here. We're not seeing any defined teeth like our sharks or maybe like ourselves, right? But we see these sort of ridges here. And like scissors, they're able to cut through some very, very interesting materials. So you can think about what they're eating. Would they be able to take a nice big bite of fish, kind of like a shark? Probably not, right? Maybe what they eat, and I think we actually have in for a treat because we have their favorite snack here. So we did some magic work and we have their favorite snack here, right? Let's see if you guys can figure it out. And I believe these are live. I think my friends here want to go catch some out at the aquarium, and I think they're living in here. What does it look like? Oh, wait, it's not real? No? Oh, never mind. They are not real, right? But if you take a closer look, these look a lot like jellies, right? So we're thinking about jellies. That is their favorite snack here for a lot of our sea turtles. So a lot of the sea turtles that are carnivorous, meaning that they eat meat, they're also eating jellies. But it brings up a good topic because I was told that this jar here had some real jellies here, but they look so real. However, there are no live jellies. What we have in here is actually plastic, my friends. So if the plastic was able to confuse me a little bit and thinking about how they are not live jellies in here, right? Imagine how confused those sea turtles might be. So if this looks so familiar, like it looks like a real live jellies, those sea turtles will also be eating this plastic that they might find at the bottom of the ocean floor. All right. So in that case, if we're able to compare it with maybe, yeah, if we're able to compare it with a real life image here of our jellies, right? It could look very, very familiar like the plastic that we talked about earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and hold it back. Maybe we can compare. I'm going to put it in front of me so that way you're able to see and not my green screen behind me, right? But they have this very transparent color, kind of like our moon jellies. So again, like I was mentioning earlier, if we were able to confuse them just as humans, imagine what our sea turtles are doing. They're doing the exact same thing. So if our sea turtles are also confusing them with jellies, it's really important that we talk about maybe keeping this plastic out of that ocean. And that is one of the ways that we can also think about how we impact our oceans or any animal that lives in the ocean, specifically our sea turtles. So that's one thing that we're going to be talking about just in a second. So what are some things we can do? See if you can start warming up your brain and thinking about what other ways we can help, right? Another thing we can also talk about is the population of sea turtles. So if we think about where sea turtles are coming from, remember they're reptiles, so they have to be hatching from eggs. And where do we think they're hatching their eggs? I don't know about you guys, but if I take a closer look here, it doesn't look like these little baby sea turtles, these little baby leatherback sea turtles are actually hatching underwater. They're actually on land. And that is actually where they are hatching from. So if we think about any turtle, any of our sea turtles, they actually come out of the water. They go ahead and dig a hole through all of this sand. They're going to go ahead and place those eggs in that hole that they just made, and they're going to cover up that hole nice and neat to protect them from any potential predators or maybe anybody who's visiting, like we visit the beaches all the time. So for general protection of these baby turtles. And when they are ready, when they're born, they actually find their way, just how we're watching them here. They're going to go ahead and find their way all the way to that water where they're going to be nice and safe once again. However, on their way, there might be potentially predators. There might be potentially some of us that might be interacting with them, right? And it's really important that we also make sure that we do our part to make sure that they are safe and they make it back to that ocean safely. So, if we're thinking about how they are laying eggs, for our turtles, they actually lay eggs yearly, meaning that they visit the same beaches every single time that they are laying their eggs. And if we're thinking about how to keep them safe and how to protect their homes, basically wherever they're laying their eggs, it's really important that we also protect. So, thinking about ways that we can do that, right? One of the main concerns of our population of sea turtles, especially when they're laying their eggs, it might be some environmental factors, for example, like climate change, right? If we're thinking about the temperatures rising, or we're thinking about the overall temperatures of the sand heating up, that controls a lot of whether the the gender or the sex of the sea turtles. For example, if the sand is a lot warmer, there are going to be more female sea turtles versus if the sand was a lot cooler where they're laying those eggs, there's going to be more male sea turtles. So we have to find a nice balance between both. All right. If we're thinking about other conservation reasons, one thing that we can talk about is what we do here at the aquarium. So one thing that we do as part of our sea turtle conservation is we actually have our Molina Animal Care Center. So in our Molina Animal Care Center, we actually take care of a lot of sea turtles that might be injured due to maybe boat accidents, or maybe they got caught in fishing lines. So if we're thinking about all those sea turtles that might be injured, what our team does is we actually have a team that works with sea turtle conservation, and they actually go out to beaches, or maybe we get calls of any urgent matters that need to be tended, and we actually bring any sea turtle that's injured, and then we make sure that we bring them back to health, right? So it's kind of like they're staying with us while they recover, with the ultimate goal to make sure that they go back where we brought, or where they came from, so back to their original home. So, one of the things that we do in that way is that when we bring them out, right, we actually help with that population of those sea turtles. And the team that takes care of them, again, from our Molina Animal Care Center, is our extraordinary veterinary team. So, one of the things that we do, right, as professionals is this. But, however, right, one of the things that we also can do at home is making sure that we know where our trash is going, right? So, we cannot all be at this place exactly like how we're seeing here, right? If they're bringing out that sea turtle, but we can do our part at home as well. So making sure we recycle, making sure a lot of that trash that we throw goes to the appropriate bins, and not just, for example, on the floor, because a lot of that trash actually goes into the drains and goes back to those oceans, where again, if we think about the jelly that we looked at, or the example of our plastic, it's going to look a lot similar than the favorite foods for a lot of our sea turtles. So we want to make sure that we help them stay nice and healthy as well. Another part that we can do right at home is just educating ourselves, right? You're already doing a wonderful job by joining us today, and you can also make sure that you spread the information that you learned today about our wonderful sea turtle lives, right? And spread that information maybe to another grown up, maybe to another person that you have nearby, right? But being able to share that information now that we all learned it together and explore the wonderful world of sea turtles. So again, we're all doing our part to help them, our sea turtles, have a wonderful life. And in general, we're also exploring all of the wildlife that we just talked about today. All right, my friends. So it was a very wonderful time exploring with you today. I know I got to learn lots of wonderful things about our sea turtles, a variety of our sea turtles. We talked a lot about their species. We took a closer look at our leatherback sea turtles, some adaptations that they have. We talked a little bit about their reproduction, or how they're laying eggs, and we also talked a little bit about sea turtle conservation. So what exactly can we do at our own homes to start this conversation? All right, my friends, so I had a really wonderful time together with you for on our aquarium online exploration, and I hope to see you soon. Bye, everyone.